The country club ballrooms sparkled under crystal chandeliers, filled with the elite of Los Angeles business society. Dad's retirement party was everything he'd dreamed of: 200 guests, an open bar stocked with top-shelf liquor, and a prime rib dinner that cost more per plate than most people spent on groceries in a month. After 40 years of building Rodriguez construction into a multi-million-dollar empire, Eduardo Rodriguez was finally ready to hand over the reins to my brother Carlos and enjoy the fruits of his labor. I stood near the bar in my simple black dress, watching my family work the room like seasoned politicians. Dad, resplendent in his custom Armani tuxedo, moved from group to group, accepting congratulations and sharing war stories from 4 decades in construction. Mom, elegant in her designer gown, played the perfect corporate wife, graciously accepting compliments on the party's elaborate decorations. "Isabella, darling." My Aunt Patricia approached with a champagne flute in one hand and judgment in her eyes. "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd be able to get the evening off from work." The words stung, though she delivered them with a smile that probably fooled everyone except me. Aunt Patricia had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, wielding concern like a weapon to highlight other people's supposed shortcomings. "I managed," I replied, taking a sip of my club soda. I'd learned years ago that staying sober at family events was essential for survival. "That's wonderful, dear. How is the restaurant business treating you? Still working at that little diner downtown?" Before I could correct her, for the 100th time, about where I actually worked, my uncle Roberto appeared beside her like a shark sensing blood in the water. At 58, Roberto Rodriguez commanded attention wherever he went, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence filling the space around him like expensive cologne. As the senior partner at Rodriguez and Associates law firm, he was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Patricia, are you interrogating my poor niece about her career again?" He laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. "Leave Isabella alone. Not everyone can be as ambitious as the rest of us." "I was just asking about her job," Patricia protested, though her eyes sparkled with malicious interest. "Ah yes, the waitressing." Roberto took a large gulp of his whiskey and surveyed the room with obvious satisfaction. "You know, Isabella, there's no shame in honest work. Someone has to serve the coffee and take the orders." The conversation was drawing attention from nearby guests, business executives, city councilmen, and other members of LA's professional elite. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring my simple dress against their designer gowns, my modest jewelry against their obvious wealth. "Actually," I began, but Roberto was already warming to his favorite topic: the Rodriguez family's impressive achievements. "Look around this room," he continued, gesturing broadly with his whiskey glass. "Your father built a construction empire from nothing. Your brother Carlos is taking over operations and expanding into commercial development. Your cousin Miguel runs the most successful accounting firm in the city. Your sister Ana married a federal judge." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the assembled guests who were now openly listening to our conversation. "And then there's Isabella," he said with a chuckle that made my cheeks burn. "She's just a waitress. Not exactly family achievement material, but someone has to bring the coffee, right?" The comment drew polite laughter from the surrounding guests, the kind of nervous chuckling that happens when someone says something cruel but technically not actionable. I felt my face flush with humiliation, the familiar burn of being diminished in front of people whose respect I'd never have a chance to earn. "Roberto," Mom's voice cut through the laughter as she approached our group. At 55, Carmen Rodriguez still commanded attention, her presence refined by decades of playing corporate hostess. "Don't be rude to Isabella." "I'm not being rude, Carmen. I'm being realistic." Roberto's voice was getting louder, fueled by whiskey and the attention of his audience. "Success in this family means building something, creating wealth, employing people. Taking orders and refilling coffee cups isn't exactly in the same league." More guests were gathering now, drawn by the obvious family drama unfolding near the bar. I recognized several faces from the business pages: real estate developers, tech entrepreneurs, entertainment lawyers. The kind of people who measured worth in net value and social standing. "Isabella works very hard," Mom said, though her tone suggested she was defending me out of obligation rather than conviction. "I'm sure she does," Roberto replied with false kindness. "But let's be honest about what hard work means in this context. Your father built this empire through vision, risk-taking, and strategic thinking. Carlos is expanding into new markets and doubling the company's revenue. That's achievement. That's success. He turned to look directly at me, his eyes slightly unfocused from the alcohol but his words devastatingly clear. Isabella serves breakfast to truckers and takes home maybe $200 a week in tips. It's honest work, but it's not exactly the Rodriguez standard of excellence. The circle of guests around us had grown to nearly 20 people, all watching this public dissection of the family disappointment with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents. Uncle Roberto, I said quietly, you don't really understand what you do for work. He laughed, the sound echoing off the ballroom's high ceiling. Isabella, sweetheart, you take orders and carry plates. There's not much complexity to understand. Roberto, that's enough, Dad's voice carried across the room as he approached our group. At 65, Eduardo Rodriguez still commanded respect from everyone around him, his word final in any family dispute. Eduardo, I'm just having a conversation with your daughter about career paths, Roberto said with a shrug. Someone needs to talk to her about realistic expectations. Dad looked uncomfortable, caught between defending his daughter and maintaining peace at his own retirement party. Around us, the assembled guests watched with the kind of hungry attention that suggested this drama was far more entertaining than the scheduled speeches. This isn't the time or place, Dad said diplomatically. When is the time and place? Roberto demanded, his voice rising with alcohol-fueled confidence. When do we address the elephant in the room? Look around this party, Eduardo. Look at your guests. Business leaders, professionals, people who've built something meaningful with their lives. He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd, many of whom nodded unconsciously at being included in his definition of success. And then look at Isabella. 30 years old, no career advancement, no significant achievements, no contribution to the family's reputation. At some point we have to acknowledge that not everyone is cut out for success. The words hit me like physical blows. 30 years of family gatherings had led to this moment. Public humiliation at my father's retirement party, in front of 200 of Los Angeles's most influential people. She's trying her best, Mom said weakly, though even she seemed to believe that my best simply wasn't good enough. Trying what? Roberto pressed. She's been trying for a decade. How long do we make excuses for mediocrity? The conversation had drawn the attention of nearly half the party. Conversations at other tables had quieted as guests strained to hear the family drama unfolding near the bar. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, probably to text friends about the Rodriguez family meltdown in progress. Maybe Isabella should explain her career goals, suggested my cousin Miguel, appearing at Roberto's elbow with his wife in tow. As the successful owner of LA's premier accounting firm, Miguel had always enjoyed his position as the family's golden child, until Carlos took over the construction business. Yes, Roberto said, turning back to me with obvious relish. Isabella, why don't you tell our guests about your 5-year plan? Your career trajectory? Your professional accomplishments? 20 pairs of eyes focused on me, waiting for an answer that would either justify my existence or confirm their suspicions about the family failure. I could feel my phone buzzing in my purse, but ignored it in favor of trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make the situation worse. I'm working on some projects, I said quietly. Projects? Roberto laughed, the sound carrying across the ballroom. What kind of projects? Learning the lunch menu? Mastering the art of coffee refills? The cruel laughter that followed felt like being flayed alive in public. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and escape this nightmare of public humiliation. Roberto, you're being cruel, Anna finally spoke up from across the circle. My sister had arrived with her federal judge husband, both of them looking uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I'm being honest, Roberto replied. Someone in this family needs to acknowledge reality. Isabella is 30 years old with no career, no achievements and no prospects. At some point we stop calling it finding herself, and start calling it what it is, failure to launch. My phone was buzzing insistently now, but I was too mortified to check it. The assembled guests were watching with the kind of fascination usually reserved for public executions, their faces a mixture of sympathy and superiority. Uncle Roberto, I tried again, my voice barely audible over the ambient party noise. What, Isabella? What profound wisdom are you going to share with us? What insights from your illustrious career in food service? The mockery in his voice was so thick I could taste it. Around the circle, guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between entertainment and second-hand embarrassment. I'm not a waitress, I said finally, my voice getting stronger despite my humiliation. Oh, excuse me, Roberto said with exaggerated contrition. Are you a server? A hospitality professional? What politically correct term would you prefer for taking orders and carrying plates? I don't take orders or carry plates. Then what exactly do you do, sweetheart? Because every time anyone asks about your job, you give vague answers about working in the service industry. He turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a courtroom lawyer making his closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen, my niece Isabella has spent the last 10 years working in the service industry, without any clear career advancement or professional recognition. She lives in a studio apartment, drives a car older than some of your children, and has never contributed anything meaningful to the family business or reputation. The words were like daggers, each one carefully aimed to maximize damage. I felt tears beginning to form behind my eyes and fought desperately to maintain some shred of dignity. But she's working on projects, Roberto continued with mock sincerity. Mysterious projects that she can't or won't describe to her own family. Projects that apparently don't generate enough income to afford anything beyond basic survival. My phone was vibrating so insistently now that several people were looking at my purse with curiosity. Whatever was happening, it was urgent enough to override my embarrassment. Excuse me, I said, pulling out my phone to silence it. Oh, by all means, Roberto said grandly. Perhaps it's your boss calling you in for an emergency shift. Someone probably called in sick and they need their most experienced coffee pourer. The assembled guests laughed again, the sound echoing through the ballroom like breaking glass. I glanced at my phone screen and saw 17 missed calls from my assistant, my lawyer, my publicist, and several numbers I didn't recognize. Before I could process what the calls might mean, the large-screen television mounted on the ballroom's far wall suddenly switched from the muted cocktail music video to a breaking news alert. The change was so abrupt that conversations throughout the room began to die as people turned to look at the screen. We interrupt this programming for breaking news, the anchor announced, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system. A major acquisition in the tech industry has just been announced that will reshape the landscape of artificial intelligence development. The room fell silent as 200 guests turned their attention to the television. Even Roberto stopped mid-sentence, his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. Local tech company Neuralink Technologies has been acquired by Google in a deal worth $2.3 billion, the anchor continued. The acquisition represents Google's largest AI-focused purchase and signals the tech giant's commitment to advanced machine learning development. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. $2.3 billion was the kind of number that commanded attention even in a room full of successful businesspeople. The sale makes Neuralink founder and CEO Isabella Rodriguez one of the youngest billionaires in California. The anchor continued as my official headshot filled the screen, the professional photo from my Stanford graduation that had been used in every business publication for the past 5 years. The ballroom went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every glass froze in midair. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the television screen showing my face next to a graphic reading, Isabella Rodriguez, CEO Neuralink Technologies, $2.3 billion sale. Then slowly those 200 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. Roberto's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the silence like a gunshot. Holy shit, someone whispered from the back of the crowd. The news report continued, oblivious to the family drama it was destroying. Rodriguez founded Neuralink 6 years ago while completing her PhD in artificial intelligence at Stanford. The company's revolutionary neural network technology has applications in autonomous vehicles, medical diagnosis, and financial modeling. My cousin Miguel made a sound like air escaping from a balloon. Anna's husband, the federal judge, stared at the screen with his mouth hanging open. Neuralink's proprietary algorithms have been licensed by Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries, the anchor continued. The Google acquisition includes all patents, technology, and the entire 200-person engineering team Rodriguez assembled over the past 6 years. 200 people. I'd been employing 200 engineers and researchers while my family assumed I was serving coffee for tips. Rodriguez, who holds multiple patents in machine learning and artificial intelligence, declined to comment on her future plans following the acquisition. Sources close to the deal suggest she will remain with Google as a senior vice president of AI development with a compensation package worth an additional $300 million over 5 years. Dad was staring at the screen like he was watching footage of aliens landing on the White House lawn. Mom had gone completely pale, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. The news report switched to footage of Neuralsync's headquarters, a gleaming glass building in Palo Alto that I designed personally, complete with a rooftop garden and state-of-the-art research facilities. This is the building where Rodriguez and her team developed the technology that's being called the breakthrough of the decade in artificial intelligence research. The anchor explained as the camera panned across the lobby where my portrait hung next to awards from MIT, Stanford, and the National Academy of Sciences. Roberto was staring at me like I'd just revealed that I was actually an alien wearing a human suit. His face had gone through several color changes before settling on a pale green that suggested nausea. The acquisition makes Rodriguez the third youngest female billionaire in American history, the news report continued, and establishes her as one of the most influential figures in artificial intelligence development. The camera switched to stock footage of me speaking at a tech conference, addressing an audience of thousands while wearing the same simple black dress style I favored for all public appearances. Rodriguez is known for her understated public persona and her preference for remaining out of the spotlight despite her company's high profile in the tech industry, the anchor noted. Colleagues describe her as brilliant but modest, preferring to let her technology speak for itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a room full of people who'd spent years assuming I was unsuccessful because I dressed modestly and avoided drawing attention to myself. The news report concluded with a final shot of my official portrait and the Google logo. We'll continue following this story as details emerge about what many are calling the most significant AI acquisition in tech history. The television switched back to the cocktail music video, but no one in the ballroom was paying attention anymore. 200 guests stood in complete silence, staring at me like I'd just performed an impossible magic trick. Roberto was the first to break the silence, his voice coming out as a barely audible croak. You're Isabella Rodriguez? I've always been Isabella Rodriguez, I replied quietly. You just never bothered to find out what that meant. The silence stretched on until I could hear the ice maker cycling in the bar behind me and the distant sound of traffic on Wilshire Boulevard. $2.3 billion, Miguel whispered, his accountant's brain struggling to process the number. Plus the additional compensation package, I added helpfully. Though that's spread over 5 years, so it's more like $40 million annually in stock options and bonuses. Patricia made a sound like a deflating balloon. You sold your company to Google? This morning, actually. The paperwork was finalized around 10 a.m. I came straight here from the signing. But you said you worked in service industry, Roberto managed, his voice still barely functional. I do work in the service industry, I replied. I provide artificial intelligence services to Fortune 500 companies. I just never specified what kind of service. The explanation seemed to break something in his brain. He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language he couldn't quite translate. Your apartment, Anna said weakly. You said you lived in a studio apartment. I said I had a small place. I never said it was an apartment. It's actually a small house in Palo Alto. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, nothing too fancy. I prefer modest living spaces. But your car, Mom added, her voice barely audible. You drive that old Honda. I like the Honda. It's reliable and efficient. Though I also have the Tesla Model S for longer trips and the Porsche for weekends. They're in the garage at the Malibu house. The revelations were hitting them like waves against a seawall. Each answer created new questions, new impossibilities to reconcile with their assumptions about my life. Malibu house? Patricia squeaked. Beach property. I bought it last year for the tax benefits and the investment potential. $12 million, but the location should appreciate significantly over the next decade. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Isabella, why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air like smoke. 200 guests waited for my answer, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and desperate curiosity. When would I have told you? I asked gently. During family gatherings where Uncle Roberto explained how I was the family disappointment? While you all discussed my lack of achievements and career prospects? While you speculated about my financial struggles and professional failures? The words hit the assembled crowd like stones thrown into glass. I watched my family grapple with the reality of their behavior, with the knowledge that they'd spent years diminishing someone who had quietly built an empire while they weren't paying attention. We didn't know, Mom said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You didn't ask, I corrected. For 6 years I've been running a company, employing hundreds of people, developing technology that's changing the world. And for 6 years, you've all assumed I was unsuccessful because I didn't fit your definition of achievement. Roberto was still staring at me like I was an optical illusion he couldn't quite resolve. But you never talked about your work. You never mentioned patents or technology or... Because every time I tried to explain what I did, you interrupted to tell me about real jobs and actual careers. You decided I was a waitress and nothing I said could change that narrative. The weight of 6 years of accumulated assumptions was finally being lifted, and it felt both liberating and exhausting. 2.3 billion, Carlos said, speaking for the first time since the news report. As the heir to Dad's construction empire, he was probably calculating how my net worth compared to the family business. That's more than our company's entire valuation. Significantly more, I agreed. Though I want to be clear, money isn't everything. Dad built something meaningful with Rodriguez Construction. You're all successful in your own ways. But you're a billionaire, Miguel said, his voice full of wonder and horror. As of this morning, yes. Though the title feels a bit surreal. The crowd around us was beginning to murmur. Other guests processing what they'd witnessed and probably calculating how this revelation would change their perception of the Rodriguez family hierarchy. Isabella, Dad said, his voice breaking slightly, I'm so sorry. We all are. How can you ever forgive us? I looked around at these people who had raised me, who had shaped me, who had spent 6 years making me feel small while I was quietly changing the world. There's nothing to forgive, I said, though the words felt complicated even as I spoke them. You made assumptions based on limited information. It happens. But we were so cruel, Anna said, tears streaming down her face. So dismissive and condescending. Yes, you were, I agreed. But you also raised me to be independent, to work hard, and to prove myself through actions rather than words. In a way, your skepticism motivated me to build something undeniable. Roberto was still staring at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. The service industry, he mumbled. You said you worked in the service industry. I provide services to clients, I explained patiently. Artificial intelligence services, consulting, technology development. It's a service business, just not the kind you assumed. The explanation seemed to break the last of his resistance. He sat down heavily in a nearby chair, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. What happens now? Patricia asked quietly. How you know the truth, I said. The question is what you do with it. We want to do better, Dad said immediately. All of us. We want to understand your work, support your success, celebrate your achievements. I hope so, I said. Because despite everything, I love this family. But I won't tolerate being treated like a failure anymore. The party around us was slowly returning to normal, though I could see groups of guests engaged in intense conversations, probably discussing what they'd just witnessed. The Rodriguez family dynamic had just shifted dramatically and everyone in the room knew it. Isabella, Roberto said, his voice finally returning to something approaching normal volume. Your work? Artificial intelligence. Could you explain it to someone who clearly doesn't understand anything about modern technology? I smiled at the genuine curiosity in his voice, the first authentic question he'd asked me in years. I'd be happy to, I said. Though it might take more than one conversation. We have time, Mom said quickly. All the time you need. As the evening progressed, I found myself surrounded by family members who suddenly wanted to understand my work, my success, my life. The transformation was dramatic. From family disappointment to family celebrity in the span of a single news report. But more importantly, it felt like the beginning of honest relationships built on reality rather than assumptions. For the first time in 6 years, I was being seen for who I actually was rather than who they thought I should be. The retirement party continued around us, but our little corner of the ballroom had become something different. A family finally getting to know the daughter they'd never bothered to understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth $2.3 billion in validation.